Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar with Java with Otava around the myths and realities of backup for your Microsoft 365 environments. We're pleased to have a few folks join us today in our roundtable. We'll turn it over to each one of these individuals to introduce themselves, give a quick background and summary of their experience. So, Phil, let's start with you, sir.
Thanks. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Phil Shih. I'm the Managing Director of Structure Research, calling here into Zoom from Toronto. Structure Research is an independent research group focused on the infrastructure services industry. We follow companies like Otava and platforms like Office 365 and Veeam.
Phil, thank you. Jason, how about yourself?
Morning, everybody. Jason Duchnowski. I'm a product manager at Otava based in Denver, Colorado. A lot of my background has to do with infrastructure. I have a number of roles on the infrastructure side at EMC and Dell, Worldwide Technology, and also a backup solutions provider at Tifio, and most recently running global channels for Otava. So excited to be here.
All right, thanks, Jason. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. My name is Mike Zolman. I'm a senior systems engineer with Veeam Software. I've been with the company a little over 3 years. My primary focus is supporting partners like Otava who focus on using our products to provide services to their customers. Prior to Veeam, I was in many different roles within consulting and service providers. So I'm very familiar with the operational needs of our partners like Otava.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. And last but certainly not least, Adam.
Yeah, my name is Adam Goslin. I'm the compliance officer, chief security officer for Otava. Basically handle all of the security and compliance needs for the organization, and happy to be here. Thank you.
Very good, very good. And brief note on myself, Jeremy Bigler. I am the Director of Product Management here, in charge of this and other products and platforms for Otava, and looking forward to engaging with you around your business needs, goals, and objectives, and see if there's some synergies. With that said, team, let's jump into really some of the perceptions around Microsoft 365. As all of you know, right, Microsoft 365 is the new brand for what has historically been the Office 365 software as a service productivity suite from Microsoft. And there's an interesting occurrence here around the concept of a shared responsibility model for managing Microsoft 365 data and information. I think if we probably asked, right, most folks that we talk to out there assume that Microsoft sort of does everything as a black box, right? And they own, operate, manage, and secure our information and data. And we are a user of this as well as I'm sure many of you. However, as you see from the slide, both Microsoft and their clients share responsibility for the 365 experience and the data within the Microsoft 365 platform. Now, we're not going to go into this slide in detail. One point here that we call attention to is Microsoft has clearly articulated backups, for example, as falling within client responsibility sphere. Additionally, both short and long-term retention also fall to you, the client. Finally, typical user error, right, those things that we can't control through automation or process, accidental deletion of files, email, similar data elements, etc., as well fall to the client from both an operational and a protection responsibility. So some enlightening things here, and this is Microsoft's 365 Trust Center as a source of truth. I'd encourage each of you to go out there and do some research yourself on exactly what Microsoft is and is not doing. So this opens up the question of what type of exposure do we really face as consumers of the 365 platform? One of the things that we think about when we think about exposure, right, is a lot of the incidents that are occurring now, specifically as we're still coming off of pandemic preparedness and social distancing and remote work and distributed workforce environments. We see that 70%, right, of Microsoft users suffer from at least one compromised account, right? Microsoft account compromise is probably one of the most common environments or risks that we face. Ransomware and other social engineering, right? Phishing attacks, SharePoint penetrations, account takeovers, and this is again one of the most predominant, right? Almost 30% of all Microsoft 365 environments are compromised through account takeovers. And botnets, right? Knock knock and other botnets out there. I think we all are well aware that as we have moved into a more distributed workforce environment, right? This presents a greenfield for organizations and individuals looking to exploit potential weaknesses now to seek unprotected, uncontrolled, unsecured environments in remote workforce homes, internet cafes, Starbucks, things like that, as opposed to maybe a more traditionally better secured premises-based environment. But the root issue here is that 6 or 7 out of 10 organizations today don't really have a solid data protection plan. And this really speaks to recovery, right? As we know from security, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And how does the organization protect and recover in the event that such a situation occurs? In fact, Veeam itself did some analysis of its own client base around its protected environments. In their marketplace, roughly 74% of organizations either A, relied on Microsoft's native tools for backup and recovery, which we've already seen from the previous slide, are not necessarily what Microsoft even itself recommends for proper use here. A fairly high percentage, right, almost 55%, don't back up at all, right, believing, I think, that Microsoft does in fact preserve and protect their data. And then last but not least, there is a manual process here that some organizations pursue as well. The total 74% really don't have what we would consider to be an appropriate protection environment in place. But I'm curious, for those of us that are joining us today, what you're doing today. So Carrie, if you wouldn't mind, let's queue it up. We're going to ask these same questions to you quickly. Would love to get your response and your feedback. So you see a pop-up on your screen. Feel free to respond back. Your responses are completely anonymous, but would love to see sort of where our attendees stack up. So I'll give this about a moment or so to run, and then we'll summarize the response.
We have just over half coming in so far, so we'll give it maybe another 30 seconds for you guys to get your answers in.
And again, folks, for those of you that may be running multiple monitors, this would be on a pop-up separate from the screen share that you're seeing. All right, let's close polling here. We've got about almost 60% of you responded so far. So as of that sort of thumbnail poll, right? In order of percentage, 30% of you responded that you rely on Microsoft's native tools today for backup and recovery. 29%, thank you for your candor, said that you're not really backing up the environment at all. 20% use Veeam for Microsoft 365, and 9% use another SaaS solution. Only 2% of you, good job, manually copy data back to a premise or similar location. So this, I think, follows suit very, very closely with what we just saw from Veeam's study here. So appreciate the response, appreciate the feedback. So the threat or the opportunity to protect is not lost in the market today, right? I won't go into these. I'm sure we've all seen a lot of scary headlines recently across from both Microsoft and Microsoft 365 and other solutions around some of the impacts or some of the issues that that we've seen so far, right? Data breaches, specifically in healthcare, for example, that now are actually tied to HIPAA fines and cost recovery. Information breaches, IP information, organizational tools, data, and similar, leaving maybe with a disgruntled or exited employee. The list is endless around what could happen. In fact, this sort of really speaks to key reasons why Otava feels that it's in your best interest as organizations to protect your own internal IP, right? And that's really what your end users are creating as they're working in 365 and other platforms like that, is creating company intellectual property. Accidental deletion, right? Human resource error. We can't stop that, right? That will happen. How do you ensure that you're not exposed or not impacted by such? Other concerns, internal security, external security, compliance certainly becomes a key focus here. And then last but not least, right, ensuring that you have not only appropriate compliant or security retention and archiving for internal data within your data centers or within your environments, but also across your employee created IP, such as 365, SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. Making sure that your security and compliance, and we'll talk about this in a moment in the roundtable, extend holistically across the organization. So with that said, we're done with slides. Thankfully, I do want to start now the actual interactive roundtable portion. So I'm going to stop the screen share. We'll actually see some talking heads here, and look forward to comments and questions from you, the audience, through this process as well, that we'll try to field as time permits. So with that said, let's move into the roundtable portion specifically. Let's start, Phil, with some of the things, speaking from the standpoint of an analyst organization, structure research again. What do we really see in the market now, especially following COVID-19, from a compliance risk and need perspective, right? What do we see in, maybe remote workforce, let's start there, as an impact there to that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to unpack there. Maybe I'll start with just commenting on some of the polling and the data. I think that's reflective of what we as independent research groups see in the marketplace, is that DR, backup, data protection is, let's say half or near half when you do surveys. Obviously each sample size and survey questions are different, but I think what we've seen presented here matches up from Microsoft, from Veeam, with what we see in the market, which is that a certain amount of organizations are doing they're cognizant and taking adopting technology and services to back up. But many organizations are not doing that, perhaps not as thoroughly as they could. Maybe they haven't taken that step, or asked their service providers, or are aware of the right products and services and technology they need to make that happen. So I thought that was really compelling data, and I thought the polling was a great snapshot that there is a very diverse approach, that when it comes to organizations, backing up their data, especially when using something like Microsoft 365. Remote working, wow. I mean, all of us here are dialing in from different places. My organization is small, but also distributed. And that's, in surveying the IT users we talk to and just friends, family, and network, most professional organizations I've seen are distributed and remote in one way or another. So they've moved, and they moved rapidly. And it was kind of sudden, into that mode. And then, when this all happened, I checked in with a lot of the service providers we talked to, and absolutely, the demands of remote work, of distributed workforces, have changed quite rapidly. IT needs and requirements. I think the first wave in March, I saw a lot of calls to service providers or data center operators was, hey, customers, businesses saying, hey, we need more network capacity. What we're using right now is not enough, and we need more. With distributed teams and remote teams, you can't, if you're running an on-premise data center, data centers were a little harder to get to. Travel was more difficult. Your IT guy might be somewhere else, unable. He might be sick. He or she might be sick. That's another, consideration. So not just the travel, the fact that everybody kind of was locked down at home, but there are health, people were getting sick and unable to get on site. And so I think that kicked off, a pretty big wave of, okay, we need more seats of these various types of services like 365. And that was kind of, I think, just to not to tell too long the story, but I think that was kind of the first phase. And now, as this has gone on, I guess for about 90 days now, I think that's only starting to get into that. The second phase of that is, okay, we've got everybody up and running, we've got the tools, but wow, now we have a different kind of IT architecture. We're using multiple services. How do we, apply our data backup, our DR, our protection, our security, our compliance? How do we apply that across this spectrum? And I think that's, where we find ourselves right now, and probably why we're on this call today to talk about that and get that to move forward with solving that problem.
Good feedback. I know one of your peers, Phil, back in April, Gartner did a CFO survey and found that 74% of organizations surveyed tend to shift or plan to shift at least 5 to 20% of the workforce to remote permanently. So not only is this a immediate issue, I think, facing organizations with social distancing, but this seems to sort of put the foundation in place for what could be the new normal for a much more distributed SaaS-style compute architecture. So that brings up some interesting questions now around security and compliance. So Adam, I'm curious to some of your thoughts here from a security and a compliance standpoint as we start to move data into a more distributed, less controlled environment. What do we see here? How do we see or perceive some of that exposure?
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of the organizations out there really with the COVID hit and then and hit quickly, and everyone needed to make a pretty fast transition. And to be honest with you, the majority of the organizations that needed to make that switch, the vast majority of them didn't have a primarily remote working model even at that point in the game. So it was quite the scramble for most organizations. The direct impacts of the move to remote working, I think what we're going to start to see now is we're going to start to see more and more organizations now turning their security and compliance focus to the controls that they have around that that now fundamentally remote workforce. Because one of the biggest issues is that now you've got all of these personnel members which are now working from their home networks, and how do you secure those networks? How do you secure the hosts that are on that network? I mean, these are things that most organizations didn't even need to concern themselves with, from that perspective, because everything was sitting on the corporate network already. And so, there's a lot of different, kind of approaches that I've seen folks taking. ranging from, effectively establishing secure networks from within the, from within the remote locations, the use of, kind of virtual desktops, so that they can just control the connection to the, to the actual desktops themselves, and and then still have that sitting in their cloud-based environment. So that's another methodology. Certainly with the quick transition of equipment from that, in many cases, people were just lifting their machines out of corporate and bringing them home, and or leveraging alternative devices. So I think there's a lot of, kind of a lot of cleanup, and I think it's going to take organizations a bit to kind of make that decision around the direction, if you will.
So that's a very interesting insight there, Adam. Thank you. Phil, I'm curious, do we see this sort of trend? I mean, we're looking at this domestically, right? Do we see this sort of trend continuing in a more global marketplace? And how do we think about, the impact here, I think, to our markets, our industries, moving forward, starting to transition into that new normal, whatever that definition ends up being?
Yeah, and it'll be fascinating to see what that new normal is. I guess we're kind of in the process of living and feeling through that. I do think the trends are global. In following, the adoption of cloud and infrastructure services, we find patterns are consistent, in as markets start to mature. So what you see, for example, in the United States, you will see replicated shortly after in other markets that tend to might be a little behind in terms of overall maturity of the IT infrastructure. So yeah, absolutely. And during this pandemic, we have seen, the traffic patterns, the seat uptake, all these crazy numbers you've seen are pretty consistent. I mean, they're not particular to a specific region. They're rather, it's a tide that's lifting all the boats are moving in the same direction. In terms of what we think we're going to see long term, I do believe quite strongly that what is happening right now is also sparking and kicking off and accelerating trends and thinking that were already in motion. So Adam just referred to guys just kind of ad hoc and picking up devices and going home and just kind of dealing with the situation. Oh no, I'm locked out of the data center. Well, I've got to use a remote management tool now, or I've got to call my provider for them to help me. But all that has kicked off like, wow, okay, we need to really, a lot of large organizations say we need to accelerate our move to cloud. If this is going to be what happens, 70%, or 70% of organizations anticipate maybe a fifth of their staff being permanently remote or distributed, that means we're going to have to change the way we run IT. So I do think this is going to accelerate trends that were already in place. I think most of us on this call agree. There's a lot more outsourcing, using of outsourced infrastructure services, and the value proposition just seems to be magnified in this kind of environment. And frankly, it's part of it's just practicality. Like if you are moving to this model, you will need some of the tools that everybody here is working with. So yeah,
Makes perfect sense. Let's talk a little bit more. Adam, you brought some really good points up about risk here and compliance. Obviously, we have essentially an uncontrolled endpoint architecture in a remote model usually. And I think our predisposition maybe coming into this is that putting data up into the cloud, Microsoft 365 specifically in this case, is protected, safe, secure, backed up, everything we would expect it to be in a traditional premise environment. But I am curious, both Phil and Adam, how do we see organization handling risk and compliance now in a distributed SaaS model versus a premises-based controlled model?
Well, the reality is that they really need to, those that are subject to compliance. So there's kind of several layers of that onion. We'll make some assumptions, right? The organization's already gone out, done the digging investigation, knows what all that they're subject to, knows which various compliance standards apply to them, and how they would then then apply to their organization. And in this distributed and SaaS model, it's really kind of a shared relationship, if you will. So let's look at the kind of highlight point of today about making sure that you've got your 365 emails backed up as an example. What storage requirements, what retention requirements do you have for that information, for that data? You may be obligated to hold on to that for a certain period of time. And so, being able to know that, we've got it accessible on the cloud-based platform, but we've also got some redundancy built in, is going to be an appropriate approach for those organizations which are subject to those certain retention requirements. So certain fields will require folks to hold on to the emails for 7 years, as an example. So, whether you have turned over employees, whether you move from one hosted platform to another, you still need to be able to hold on to the information appropriately. Certainly looking at it from a security and compliance perspective regarding the providers, it is astronomically important that these organizations put together the list of all of their service providers and then go in and ask all of those sanity check questions surrounding both the division of responsibilities as well as how is that provider providing coverage against the certain compliance requirements that you have. Because for any organization, it's a mix of responsibilities. There's responsibilities for the organization themselves. There's responsibilities which are shared with their service providers. And in that case, it's important to understand who takes on which elements of that shared responsibility, so that I understand what things am I responsible for versus what things is the provider signing up for. And then those which are wholesale outsourced to that responsibility is outsourced to the service provider. Knowing those kind of three buckets of, how do the compliance requirements apply in that circumstance allows the organization to put together effectively a responsibility matrix surrounding their security and compliance objectives and clear knowledge and delineation of who carries which responsibilities through that path, and thereby they can go ahead and audit against those various line items.
Makes perfect sense. I love where you're going with that. I want to put a pin in that because I want to talk about some of the best practices and recommendations, Adam, both from a security standpoint, but then Mike also from a platform and what you're seeing from a vendor manufacturer perspective here as well. I do want to talk a little bit though quickly before we get there, Mike, around some of the things that you've seen from Veeam's perspective, right, around data loss scenarios, experience in market, right? I think you have a wide purview across a global use case for 365. What are some of the things that you've seen here that would be beneficial, I think, for our audience today?
Yeah, Jeremy. So I would say that the very first thing that usually pops up in discussions, be it with customers that are moving to Office 365 as a new service, or they've been on that platform for a while, is that they don't necessarily realize up front how critical the data that sits in the service is to their business. How much data that they're sharing with each other through the mechanism of mail or through OneDrive or even SharePoint sites, for example. And unfortunately, when they usually come to us, an event has occurred and it kind of triggers them to take a hard look at, hey, how do we prevent this from happening again? I know we can't necessarily address this particular instance, but we want to make sure we don't get hit by this again. That's one. The second one is the shared responsibility model is traditionally, and we've talked about that a lot already, so I'm not going to hit it too hard, but that's usually another educational factor with consumers of that platform is understanding what is Microsoft responsible for versus what is the customer responsible for. But then we get into kind of best practices in general, regardless of the platform. Is, you want to be able to protect your data, and when you have everything in the service, you don't have as much control necessarily. You're limited a bit by what Microsoft's admin portal allows or not allows. Whereas when you use a product like ours, that basically you can determine where the backups of the data are going to sit. So we don't lock a customer in specifically to say your data is always going to sit here. We're the software side of it. Customers can choose where they want to build out an infrastructure to protect the data, or leverage a service provider like Otava, who already has the infrastructure and configuration set up, and consume it more as a service, but know that their data is not sitting out on the Office 365 platform anymore. But the other one is also around operational things, and this is the last one I'll touch on. For example, if you have some turnover in the business and you have users that are departing the business, they still have data in O365, right? They have mailboxes, they have OneDrive data. Well, when you remove that data from the O365 subscription, it goes into an area that's only retained for 30 days. After that, unless you've taken some action, that data is now gone. So if you have a compliance requirement, as Adam's mentioned, that requires you to retain all data, for whether it's a HIPAA requirement or Sarbanes-Oxley, PCI, whatever the requirement is, Veeam can help with that retention as well, because once their data is in our backups, depending upon your retention requirements, they stay in the backups even if you remove that user from your subscription.
Good point. Good point. Thank you. And you had mentioned, Mike, a little bit of that sort of shared responsibility model. JD, I'm curious from your perspective here, where do we see the majority, I think, of gaps, perceptual or real, in that responsibility model?
Yeah, I think, when you look at moving workloads to the cloud or to a SaaS-based application, there's maybe just a misconception that you don't have to have the same sort of controls designed around that application or that data anymore, that somebody else is taking care of it because it's out in the cloud, it's outside of my four walls. And that's just not the case. It's a situation where, I think it becomes more complicated. You need to understand what policies exist in each particular cloud that you're running in or SaaS application that you're using, to see where their responsibility ends and yours picks up, where there may be some overlap or gray area that, depending on what your business's requirements are, that you may need to apply extra control around that data. So, like, for example, Mike was talking earlier about when when one of your employees leaves, what happens with that data? Well, if it was probably running on Exchange inside your four walls, I'm sure that you have a backup solution that's backing that up. You're retaining it for some period of time. Is 30 days long enough for you? Also, what happens when that that user is removed? Where does that data propagate the deletion through? So, SharePoint data stays online, but in other areas that may get deleted automatically. So there's, new challenges where I need to navigate the waters and say, well, if I want to retain this mailbox, now I need to back that up to OneDrive, as an example. Maybe I'm exporting it as a PST. So lots of new things that people need to learn. So it doesn't mean that I can wipe my hands clean. And that's really where Otava is coming in, is that we're providing that same level of, I would say, responsibility. If I want to outsource and not worry about infrastructure management anymore, and what I want to focus on is outcomes, that is what Otava is delivering. We're delivering the outcome of keeping that same enterprise class backup and recovery sort of methodology in place, even for your SaaS-based application. So I don't necessarily have to worry about the nuances with that cloud-based solution. I'm filling in that gap. It's compliant, it's secure, you know, you tell us how many users you want to back up and how long you want to retain it. And then, you know, simple discovery tools to restore the data, and you can restore it to where you want. So it's creating a more predictable, I think, outcome for clients that are still, you know, they need to overcome that misconception, right? It's not, I can't just offload things because it's out in the cloud.
No, that brings up an interesting point. How do we protect data, right? What is the recommended best practices here, or our best practices for just general operational readiness and security, but also then from a security and compliant posture perspective? So Mike, maybe I'll turn it over to you quickly to sort of give us at least a general foundation for what should maybe a good foundation best practice level be for organizations who do want a little bit more deeper level protection than what is offered in the Microsoft 365 platform.
Sure. So it really comes down to the business requirements, because every business or business vertical is a little bit different as far as whether they have compliance needs specifically, or if it's just an internal business decision that says we're going to handle this in this particular way and method. But traditionally, for example, some customers that using the 365 platform may not leverage SharePoint very much, if at all, and their focus is mainly email or Office or OneDrive, for example. Well, in that case, the best practice would be you might want to exclude all SharePoint type things, because when we're backing up all of these services, obviously it increases load, both on the backup systems itself, but also on the subscription. You know, that's one area that's kind of best practice. So part of it's evaluating how you're leveraging the 365 platform. What real services are you using, and where are you storing data there? The other thing is the best practice is really determining your retention requirements, whether it's driven by compliance or driven by business leadership, that they say, here's our policy for the business. And it may be different across the business. For example, you may have certain types of inside the business, line of business, that says, look, for executive staff and or HR, finance, those types of departments, we need to keep data longer. We want to keep data longer, whereas a standard knowledge worker, we may keep data only 6 months or maybe 1 year instead of 3 years or 5 years, for example. So the best practice is I mean, we're talking more about kind of business policy and how you would execute this policy, whether it's driven by compliance or just business strategy, with the tools of Veeam. And that's the idea, is Veeam doesn't dictate here is exactly the best practice until you get into the uber deep technical weeds on like speeds and feeds and sizing and that kind of stuff. And then obviously we have some very granular, detailed recommendations on best practice. But I think most companies need to start at the compliance or business strategy level, because those decisions will define what the technical requirements need to be.
Now, good feedback there. Thank you. JD, what have you seen in sort of your data protection history here around organizations seeking to maybe standardize or supplement their protection strategy?
I think what can happen over a period of time is you start incorporating a whole bunch of different tools depending on what it is that you're backing up. So maybe I have one type of a solution for cloud-based backup. I have another solution for my on-premise. I have another solution for maybe like a hybrid cloud where I am leveraging a managed service provider. One of the reasons why we chose Veeam is because I think they have a nice holistic strategy that can attack any one of those scenarios. So whether it is an application like 365 that's running in the cloud, we can protect that through a similar type experience. We can back up on-premise applications. I've seen some chat of folks that are saying, hey, we have Veeam, how do we do this in our environment? Otava is providing the same experience too, whether it's 365 or on-premise or in our cloud. So we're building out really a strategy, again, of outcomes where the same Veeam experience, which is all driven around simplicity and being able to accommodate 95, 98% of the workloads that are out there. And, I don't have to have specialists that, only are focused on this type of a platform for this type of a backup solution or, some other. So I think it creates, there's just sort of over time creates a lot of complexity. So what we're trying to do is consolidate all those tools into a single approach, pick your outcome depending on where your application's running, and you get that same experience regardless. So, I think that the sprawl exists not just in the infrastructure space or in the cloud space. We're seeing sprawl now, but also from just a tools perspective. I continue to build out my whole tools portfolio. Now I need specialists that are focused on all those different tools. At this point, I think less is more, and getting down to that simple picture. If I can use one tool to accommodate a lot of my environment, then that's a very common strategy that we're starting to see.
And that really fits into, I think, a services consolidation strategy overall, right? As organizations are faced, and Phil, I'm curious about your insights here, as organizations are faced sort of with the dichotomy of downward pressure on IT budgets, even with an increased spend in cybersecurity and similar areas. But really the focus on less is more, right? Which has been a common trend in IT since as long as I can remember. But a dramatically increasing services portfolio, right? Both in terms of application architectures, SaaS and other third-party services, and now a more distributed workforce coming in off of a variety of endpoints that are no longer necessarily organizational controlled. Sprawl becomes a key consideration. Phil, are we seeing that? Are we seeing that widespread these days?
I think that's where we are right now. It's just we're kind of in this long run transition phase from kind of more traditional legacy IT to being in the cloud. And where we are here in 2020 is a lot of organizations have made a certain amount of transition. They have certain services in the cloud, but that what sits data, users, applications, workloads, what sits in legacy environments is still very much there, and they're run in a combination of ways. They're run most likely between a mix of service providers as well as internal IT staff. And the movement and speed at which the transitions are made are often pretty slow. And frankly, they're often kind of reactive versus proactive, right? So you don't necessarily see any movement. If it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of applies in many ways until something really bad happens. And that's I find that's that's been consistent in the time I spent in the space looking at service providers and the customers they serve. They often are very they make that move based on something bad happening, and you could argue very much that COVID and the current pandemic is one of those bad scenarios. It just so happens that this bad scenario applies to so many more organizations than it does to the particular happenings of that are around a single organization. Now, everybody seems to have been affected in similar ways at the same time. And that's why, to go back to my earlier point, I do think the current environment is going to spark a lot of reaction, right? So people understand, wow, I've got all these services, I have all these compliance and security policies that are inconsistent across everything that I have, and I'm actually not consolidating. I'm actually getting a little more distributed, perhaps using more services, so I need to rein things in. So yeah, absolutely. I would say that's a pretty accurate description of where we are. It's definitely not neat and tidy. It's a bit of a mess, but within a mess lies a significant amount of opportunity to do things both for providers and the customers.
One of the other things that I was gonna mention to carry on what Phil was saying is that what I've been seeing in the security compliance space, the choices that that organizations are making. I mean, it's been slowly morphing over the last number of years, and a lot of those kind of traditional straight on-prem are starting to go look at cloud providers. Many of them have a kind of a mix, if you will. But as those organizations are looking at the shared services providers, the one thing that I don't see a lot of them kind of taking into account is is kind of the mix of the vendors and providers, what all you can get from, from one organization all consolidated versus the kind of both pain and cost that one ends up incurring going to, kind of the standalone big box, cloud solution that's going to solve one of your problems. But especially when you start layering on all of the security and compliance layers, now that you're integrating this, this vendor and that vendor and the other vendor, and there are options out there for consolidating those into kind of like the one throat to choke notion. The more that you can do that, fundamentally, the better you're going to be able to streamline things. The fewer people you have to coordinate with, and very likely you're going to end up saving a bunch of pain, time, money, startup costs, etc.
Very good. Very good. So we are approaching the top of the hour, but in summary here, what I've heard, I think, from a recommendation or a best practices standpoint is, first, examine the endpoints for your data, for your information, the platforms, the providers you're using. Understand that in contrast to your retention, to your security, to your data protection policies, either be it through governance or be it through compliance mandate or be it simply through good security practices. And then look for opportunities to protect as much as possible through consolidated architectures to minimize complexity and the need to have subject matter experts in a diverse solution portfolio. So this type of an approach, I think, makes a lot of sense. I do want to save some time, though, for questions from the attendees here. I know we've gotten a few in so far. One that's just been queued up has been, can we really take 365, right? Have that data as expected, right? And then either back that up to premise or back that up to premise and then replicate that to a cloud instance. JD, let's start with you on that one, and then Mike, love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, no problem. I'm trying to decipher, make sure that I'm interpreting the question correctly. So I'll try and broaden it out a little bit first. The answer is that Veeam can back up both the on-prem and the Office 365 environment, so it doesn't matter there where it lives. The other capability that's built into this solution is that if I do back it up, let's say in the cloud, I have the option of restoring that data into another environment that may live on premise or vice versa. So the option exists. You can kind of use it almost as a migration tool, a lot of flexibility when it comes to both the backup and the recovery aspect of it. But I want to defer to Mike, sort of resident, expert with the hands-on work, especially make sure that we got that one covered.
Yeah, JD, you're absolutely correct. So Veeam is a software component, right, of the solution. Whether that is in the scenario you described, let's say the customer has a hybrid Exchange environment where some is on premise, some of the data sits in Office 365 subscription. We can actually back both of those up. And to your point, when we go to restore, because the reality is backing up data today is considered like table stakes. It's considered expected, right? In most cases, meaning maybe not IT's perspective necessarily, and this goes back to the shared use responsibility model, but users expect that I have data, it's going to be backed up. But the reality is where you're really measured on any kind of data protection mechanism is not about whether or not you're backing it up. It's how quickly can you restore the data and can you restore it where I need it? That's really the measuring stick, right? So with Veeam, it's the software. You can back it up from the O365 subscription to an on-prem, or if you're leveraging a service provider such as Otava, you can use their service and the data will be backed up into Otava data centers, Otava infrastructure. So this really boils down again more to business decisions, because as we talked about remote workers and the shift in the landscape, more companies are shying away from making large investments of additional infrastructure into their own on-prem data centers, and they're looking for opportunities that, yes, they need this service, right? They need to back up and protect their data, but let me see what kind of as-a-service models through other providers are available for me to achieve, as JD mentions, the outcomes. Because that's really what customers are interested in, is the outcome. They don't necessarily want to deal with, you know, the hardware buying and capital expenditures and all this stuff, right? But the Veeam's the software. You can pair it with on-prem hardware. I've seen folks actually build out the software components in, for example, a public cloud infrastructure that's not Microsoft, and back it up there. I've also seen them leverage service providers as well. So there's a lot of flexibility in regard to how you leverage the Veeam platform to protect that data, with multiple options depending upon your strategy.
Great, thank you, Mike. Another question that just has come in is let's say we are backing up 365, right? And we want to have that data traffic coming in from Azure, right, to a premise-based 365 deployment. How do we control bandwidth consumption on that?
Is that for me, Jeremy? I'm sorry.
Sure, Mike, go right ahead, jump in.
So the bandwidth, there are some settings and configuration that you can do within the Veeam product at what we call our proxies, right? The proxies are the worker nodes that are responsible for reaching out and pulling data from the source and then processing that data to send to the repository where the backups will be stored. But the throttle mechanism, you can throttle either based on bandwidth or number of threads that are allowed. But the reality is, here's the reality of that. And that's a great question. And I would say for traditional data protection solutions or scenarios, that's a very important thing to understand. With Microsoft, on the other hand, they're notorious for figuring out, you know, through different algorithms that that you're pulling a lot of data very quickly out of a subscription, and they will throttle you. So very traditionally, you're not worried about the network bandwidth coming into you. It's more about the Microsoft ends throttling how much data you're allowed to pull at once. And Veeam also has some mechanisms in there that's pretty smart about when we're being throttled, and we'll go back up something else that's not being throttled and come back to the one that was throttled a little later on and continue onward.
Appreciate that, Mike. Thank you. Thank you. Folks, I do want to wrap up today's conversation. Obviously, respectful of everybody's schedule out here. Appreciate the questions. I do want to keep information coming. And if you do have continued questions, feel free to use the question option within your environment to keep them flowing. I do want to, during this point in time, also reinforce the fact, number one, we'd love to continue the conversation with you one-on-one, right? As we stated before, there is not a silver bullet, one size fits all. This covers not only your data protection strategy, but then nuances of that strategy, right? Recovery windows, frequency, retention, all of that, right? And that varies based on industry, security posture, compliance requirements, and a number of other factors. So up on the screen, you should see information on how to reach out and contact us, but also invite you to check out our YouTube channel as well. We do Java with Otava videos on a number of topics, most of them pure informational based, and would welcome you to take a look into those and research them at your leisure. Finally, this recording has been, or this session has been recorded, and we will be sharing with you the recording as well as a PDF version of the deck that we've covered today for follow-up. So I do want to keep the bridge open here for any additional questions, but in advance of those, I want to thank each of you for your attendance today and look forward to continuing the conversation following up with you after today's event.
Yeah, Jeremy, while we're kind of waiting to see any additional questions that come in, I do want to reinforce the fact that if you search for Java with Otava and the YouTube videos out there, I did create a video that goes in another level deeper into what Otava's offering actually is. So you can get a little bit of that detail. I know several folks have asked for, you know, what it is, what that service is. So we didn't really touch on that today, but just know that there is some information out there. It was recently posted, so look for the video with a picture of myself on there. You know, secondarily to that, because this is a newer service for Otava, what we are doing is a 30-day free trial of the service. So for anyone that wants to kind of dip their toe in the water, understand how it works, how simple it is, straightforward, you know, the model that we've really deployed this on is we take care of the backup and all the infrastructure, and then when you need it, you handle the restores. It's really simple discovery, e-discovery like search on Veeam's, you know, for Veeam's tool to do the restores. But just want to let everybody know that that is something that's available to all new and existing customers. So for anybody that wants to check it out, I'd love to, you know, do a trial with you and let you experience what that service is all about.
Fantastic. Thank you, JD. All right, no additional questions have come in. We will close the bridge at this point. Again, thank you for your attendance this morning. And as always, feel free to reach out for us for any questions, comments, or additional clarification we can provide. Enjoy the day, everybody.